The story of our next plenary speaker, John Phillip Santos, is one that I can't possibly hope to do justice in a 2-minute introduction. Born in San Antonio, Texas, his story is one of culture mixing, self-discovery, and working to understand multiple disparate parts of an identity that simply refuses to conform to categories and fully fit together. It's a story of bridging gaps between indigenous and Spanish heritage with a level of empathy and fairness that many of us familiar with the Mexican-American cultural struggle are unable to muster for one side or the other. Holding a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Literature from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Arts in English Literature and Language from Oxford University, as well as holding the distinguished achievement of having become the first Latinx Rhodes Scholar in 1979, Santos has produced over 40 broadcast documentaries, 4 of which received Emmy nominations. He's also written 2 memoirs and a book of poems, just to name a few of his achievements. But like many figures in the Mexican-American literary canon, John Santos has a strong connection with what many would refer to as the paranormal, that strange and even magical category of occurrences for which many of us has a tinge of normalcy, in that most people of Mexican descent have either seen or know someone who has seen the spirit of a dead loved one, has had some vision of the future or past, or whose grandmother taught them to heal sicknesses with a touch or prayers and incantations. To many interpreters, however, these are not accounts, but metaphors or simple parroting of obsolete superstition. The fact of the matter is that Mexican and Mexican-American intellectual canons are saturated with accounts, with testimonios of these types of occurrences, often referencing direct experience. In my experience as a scholar, I have frequently encountered the perception that all too often Mexican-American philosophy is not so much philosophical as it is poetic, or that what is stated to be autobiographical within our canon is often written too metaphorically, that when dealing with our own cultural history, we stray too far from the comfort of the historical and into the fantastical. Our histories are at best painted as beautiful, cultural, and ethnically specific fiction. At worst, our histories are the products of primitive superstition, which are worth containing, devaluing, and erasing for the crime of not acquiescing to the all-important march of progress, with the question of who defines progress being met with a deafening and yet knowing silence. Having seen this himself, John Santos willingly and proudly states that what he writes is not metaphor, and that what is often interpreted as metaphor in Mexican-American memoir is not metaphor, is not poetic mixing of genre, but testimonio, which speaks to an inspirited and deeply paranormal world. The same world in which I grew up, where my father speaks easily to the birds outside the house, and my great-grandmother Carolina knows exactly what to do when someone in the family is afflicted with mal de ojo, the evil eye. We're going to get a glimpse into this world today. Please join me in welcoming John Phillip Santos.
Thank you, Brother Stefan. And allow me to thank all of you, queridos, queridas, with much love and respect. I can imagine, standing before you right now, I'm thinking about the immortal words of Cheech Marin in Up in Smoke. Who's this Indio? I don't know if you remember that great moment, that unforgettable scene. I regard it as an honor, a slightly intimidating honor, maybe even a bit of audacity, to be honest, to join the roster of august personages presenting at this auspicious, path-breaking symposium. My presence here can be attributed, of course, to our esteemed brother, visionary and convener, Jeffrey Kripal. Some serendipities. I was first introduced to Jeff's work through his collaboration with Whitley on the supernatural, a new vision of the unexplained. I was in Sydney early in 2016, and Whitley and Jeff were interviewed on Coast to Coast AM. I didn't know about this book. Upon returning home, I quickly got the book and read Jeff writing about the future of the past. saying we need to come to terms with the simple fact that, yes, we can now read the past in ways that past peoples could not read their own presents. Our future changes the meaning of their past. This was eerily synchronous for me. Strange as it sounds, eerily synchronous for reasons I'll go into later. And I was thinking, holy shit, this was happening, and in academia, no less. Then last summer, I was invited by University of Sydney Professor James Jordarian, who'd been working in lodging. I'd been working in lodging with him back in 2016 to contribute something for a conference on quantum aesthetics and theory. What was the contribution? I would drive to Houston to meet Jeff Kripal for the first time for a breezy 90-minute interview on quantum metaphysics. And a sine qua non conversation was underway. And indeed, that conversation continues apace, so many thanks to Jeff for bringing all of us together and for the audacious invitation to share these thoughts with y'all tonight. And mil gracias, of course, to the team of Superhuman Archives of the Impossible cohort who study and work with Jeff to manifest this incomparable community this weekend of thought and inquiry. My reflections this evening will be on the theme Encuentros no imaginables en lugares increibles, or unimaginable encounters in incredible places, locating the Borderlands in the archives of the impossible. I spent a day in the archives about a month ago, a reconnaissance visit that barely scratched the surface of the collection. I looked through 3/4 of one of the dozens of bankers' boxes of communion letters. And then a fascinating but exciting thrum through 2 boxes of material in the Edwin May collection related to the controlled remote viewing program. More on both of these later. I've spent much time in some of the great archives of the world, in England, Spain, Mexico, across the US and Texas. This is indeed an archive to get lost in for a great spell. An archive my literary mentor, Jorge Luis Borges, another enthusiast of archives, would have surely exulted over and luxuriated within. I came away from that day with a general question and a specific query on that question. What role does place play in eruptions of the paranormal, from psychic phenomena and healings to UFOs and other astounding manifestations, stories of interactions between the living and dead, and more? And specifically, what story can we discern regarding these phenomena across the historic borderlands of the southwestern United States, especially the Texas borderlands of my home? How are we implicated in that story? Perhaps these greater borderlands I know best, from Tenochtitlan to Roswell and Chaco Canyon, have a unique, perhaps central role in an unfolding, a coming to light, a coming to understandings of the impossible in these times. How might such an archive as this one help us to advance that investigation? Throughout the talk, I'm using some images from painter, mystic, geomancer, another mentor, Pedro Luján, a series of paintings that deal with questions of mystic understandings of place. Through the travels, archival research, and studies I've conducted for my 2 slightly hallucinated family memoirs, I discovered accounts of extraordinary events and unimaginable encounters from sources as diverse as ancient rock art of Coahuila and West Texas, ancient Mesoamerican códices, the chronicles of Spanish explorers, testimonios of early settlers, the work of Texas folklorists, and myriad stories of Borderlands, Mestizo, Mestiza, denizens of the now. Some of that material is what I want to share tonight. I've written out of those stories, but never really straight at them. This has been a opportunity for me to really confront, to reckon with this little collection of tales. Many stories of this occulted archive, not an occult archive, but occulted archive, are dismissed as fabrications or curiosities, as Stefan characterized, pushed aside in canonical history's readings of this other American origin story, the origin story from the South. The story of the conquest and settlement of New Spain, the creation of Mexico, the birth of Texas. Through another lens, foregrounding this palimpsest of stories, we trace hidden continuities, a profound story of human immanence and becoming, of a longue durée encompassing millennia of discoveries and revelations transpiring in the landscape of events that we now call the Borderlands. In this light, they aren't so much anomalous occurrences as evidence of a mystery about these lands that is coeval with the long presence of discovering who we are. This prolegomena of sorts will necessarily be swift and synoptic. I'm not going to be parsing specific terms, broad brushstrokes, to allow some time to explore a larger narrative framework through which this deeper story of human becoming might be viewed. In the words of Terence McKenna, if the truth can be told in a way that can be understood, it will be believed. Borderlands are by their nature places at the edges of worlds, contact zones, in the words of anthropologist Mary Louise Pratt, places where strangers meet, where the legal, social, and cultural strictures of capitals and seats of empire can't reach, and where the friction of colliding worlds and cosmologies, often bloody, can also produce bursts of new light from unanticipated mixtures and fissions, mestizajes, mixtures of people and their histories. This map is one of the first empirical cartographies of what would become the Texas-Mexico borderlands, documenting the mid-18th century expeditions of José Escandón. The Rio Grande runs through the picture at the top here, right here actually. The Rio Grande runs through the middle of the lands that were still largely unknown, the tierra de salvajes y infieles, the land of the savage unbelievers. I grew up as a poet in San Antonio, Texas, shuttling between there and the towns and Sierra ranches of Coahuila, one of the northernmost border states of Mexico, where my father's families, mestizos with Jewish and Kickapoo heritage, there should be more Kickapoo Jews in this world, where they had come from. It's a swath of borderlands geography that takes only 5 hours to traverse, linking worlds that are so different and so kindred. In Coahuila, there were stories of a valley of silence, left without sound since the time of creation. Up in the Sierra, it once rained stones. Spirits of the ancestors could find their way to their old homes, following trails of orange-petaled cempasúchil flowers, orange chrysanthemums. The ancestors were among us. That was just the way it was. Back home in San Antonio, we lived in the space age, and NASA was just down the road. My Uncle Charles ran the mission photo lab there, and after every flight in the Gemini and Apollo era, he would send us a thick packet of photographs of that mission's adventures and their images of the Earth. of the moon, the astronauts going about their everyday duties, weightless, kind of images that would give Martin Heidegger sleepless nights. But San Antonio, a very old place that has been occupied by humans for at least 12,000 years, was also a haunted place. According to my Rosicrucian grandmother and her mystic sisters, all souls who had once walked this place might still present themselves if you knew how to look for them. There were stories of La Lechuza, a giant owl-like bird with a woman's face who comes upon you in the night to clutch you and take you aloft. There were stories of a donkey lady, of a demonio with hooves instead of feet, personages you might encounter in a dance club. And there was the story of La Llorona, a woman whose plaintive cries could be heard in the distance searching for her lost children, a story that had come down to us from the Aztec world. In San Antonio, it was possible to live between an ancient world of magical forces and creatures present in this world and the sleek space-age off-world dreams of the future. And San Antonio's story emerged in medias res out of a still much older story. When did the hidden chronicle of wonders of these lands begin? The ancient indigenous peoples of these borderlands were myriad and diverse, except for the Caddos northeast of where we are tonight. They left no lasting settlements or cities, no statuary or codified language. Their arrow points, exquisitely differentiated, excavated across the lands, would become a marvelous way of testifying to what was a diaphanous array of differently specialized technologies, identities, cultures. We know them through mute pieces of stone. In the Pecos River Valley, the marvelous white shaman mural is said to give evidence of the widespread practice of the sacred peyote medicine ritual, linking the people of those lands to the Huicholes of central Mexico today. Curiously, Mesoamerican civilizations of central Mexico all shared the same story of their ancestors coming from the north into the south, from a place variously known as Chicomostoc, pictured here from the Codex Chichimeca Tolteca. Chicomostoc, Coatepec, Tecoloacan, or Aztlán, the place of whiteness, the place of Hurons. 7 caves, 7 tribes settled around a lake or a watery place of abundant springs. Illumination has come upon us here. Historical memory was preserved of their ancestors, emerging as pilgrims out of the churning vortex of humanity that was, perhaps, ancient Texas, setting out on a sacred road of magical becoming that would transform them into new peoples. In the Chichimeca Mapa de Cuauhtinchan #2, painted in 1540, but telling a story from 300 years before, the ancestors are depicted coming out of Chicomostoc here in the upper left corner, going on a labyrinthine path of discovery, passing through the great capital city of Chicomostoc and then finding a way to their new home. It was a way of remembering a story from 3 centuries before, a story of transformation and becoming. In the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan, this story is told of setting out from just such a watery place, encircled by 7 caves, the birthplace of the first clans. This is a story of my life, light and dark, intervals of light and dark. Sorry, Chichimecas, if I'm not telling the story correctly, forgive me. So they set out from just such a a place, as Chico Mostok represented in the other codex I just showed you. 7 caves around a watery place. The incredible continuity of the image without the internet is astounding, because these were not people from the same place. And it's a pictographic memory that is itself quite an astounding achievement. And they're led out of Chico Mostok on their long journey in search of a new homeland by a female warrior. She's named Obsidian Butterfly, and she's here literally flying out from Chico Mostok, grasping a leg trophy. Not a sister to be messed with, Obsidian Butterfly. So on this journey that takes place on the left side of this extraordinary mapa, they encounter drownings and wonders and marvels, earthquakes, whirlwinds, all of them associated in intercessions with divine forces that were present in the natural world. All of these images have depictions. For instance, this one that I just showed you is associated with the god Quetzalcoatl, but in his incarnation as the wind god Hecatl. So these were events happening in history that represented interactions with these divine forces, drownings and earthquakes, literally being swallowed up by the earth. Once they establish their new home, it is in a region where there exists a sort of cosmic omphalos, or dimensional portal on the landscape, represented here by the spiraling cosmic tree and entwined snakes. The history was not supernatural. The wonders chronicled were interwoven into the warp and woof of history. In the Mexica Nahua Aztec version of the story in the Boturini Codex, their ancestors too set out from a watery place of 7 caves. And they travel with their god, Huitzilopochtli, seen here in a little mochila, little backpack, the sacred bundle backpack. He's directing them on their journey to the south, a journey that will last them 100 years before the founding of the imperial city of Tenochtitlan, today's Mexico City. Knowing all that would unfold with the arrival of the Spaniards 200 and some years later, what can we say about these various strangers at the time of first contact? Notably, in that Mapa de Cuautinchan, painted in 1540, 20 years after the conquest, they don't even mention the Spaniards. The Spaniard story was not what they wanted to tell. It was indeed a time of wonders for both the Iberian and indigenous peoples, a time when history, myth, and magic were inextricably bound together. In Wonders in the Sky, Jacques Vallée and Chris Aubeck's invaluable chronicle of unexplained aerial objects from antiquity to modern times, we're told how Christopher Columbus and one of his sailors on the evening before first landfall on October 11th, 1492, saw a mysterious light on the horizon, like the light of a wax candle moving up and down, they described it. Admiral Columbus took it to be a sign from beyond that they were near land, and he and the sailor prayed to the Virgin Mary. A new world was about to be revealed to them. Vallée and Aubeck cite another event in 1518 in the Yucatan, a year before Cortés would begin his campaign of conquest against the Aztec Empire. Another conquistador, Juan de Grijalva, reported witnessing a star above the ship after sunset, and it moved away, emitting rays of light continuously until it was above the town or a large village, and it left a trace that lasted for 3 long hours. For Grijalva, this phenomenon was an auspicious omen. We understood that God wanted us to populate the land. Again, the event represented God speaking to him into historical time through a magical sign. Among the Spanish, there was even an early abduction tale from 1521, the year after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Dr. Eugenio Torralba of Cuenca, Spain, told of his interactions with a magical creature, or duende, named Sequiel, who revealed healing secrets to him and took him on a flight to Rome. His story was commemorated in Cervantes' Don Quixote, where Quixote says, "Remember the story of Dr. Torralba, who was taken by the devils through the air, and in 12 hours he arrived in Rome." So not entirely a rapid flight from Cuenca to Rome, but an achievement in 1521. Despite great celebrity for his healings, Dr. Torralba was arrested, tortured, and imprisoned by the Inquisition, and only released on the condition that he have no further contact with the devilish Sequiel. Dr. Torralba's story epitomizes a struggle already underway across the aborting Spanish Empire in the decades after La Reconquista, with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, to extinguish any magic that didn't advance the mission of achieving the prophesied triumph of the church, the return of Christ at the end of time. Mind-forged manacles were taking shape. In his book, Beyond Geography, The Western Spirit Against the Wilderness, the poet-historian Frederick Turner characterizes this period of Spanish history and its relation to a militarized Christianity as a crisis cult that evolved into a state religion. Something very similar could be said of the Aztec Empire in the pre-contact era. They too were a cosmic cult that became a state religion, evoking a profound and destabilizing spiritual insecurity, to use a phrase from anthropologist Adam P. Ashforth. 4 worlds had already perished before. These 4 little glyphs here represent the 4 previous worlds, and Nahuiolin is the present world. Rituals of sacrifice, urgent rituals of sacrifice to forestall another catastrophe, reflected the high stakes of living in a predatory universe where humanity was the prey. Their world was full of signs communicating truths from their future, if they could be discerned, and everyday human history was shaped by intercessions with gods and their divine potencies in the natural world. In Tenochtitlan, before the arrival and eventual victory of Cortés's army, the Emperor Moctezuma II, the second Moctezuma, was said to be the principal seer, interpreting a series of wondrous presagios, or augurs, that were understood to signal doom for the empire. In Book 12 of Fray Bernardino Sahagun's General History of Things of New Spain, also known as the Florentine Codex, we're told of how an aerial phenomenon described as a tongue of fire remained hovering in the eastern sky for an entire year. The principal shrine of the patron deity Huitzilopochtli caught fire and burned. Lightning struck the temple of the most ancient of gods, Xiotecutli. A giant comet flared from east to west. The waters of Lake Texcoco churned and boiled. 2-headed men appeared in the city, but when they were taken to Moctezuma, they disappeared. And then a water bird was captured with a mirror between its eyes. And when Moctezuma gazed into that mirror, he saw warriors mounted on numerous deer, which he understood as an ominous sign of war. The shrill voice of a woman was heard crying out from the forest, crying out and beseeching for the lives of her children, a story that would eventually find its way to San Antonio as La Llorona. Aztec doom, though, wasn't a new concern. Chronicler Diego Duran told how 50 years before, Moctezuma I had dispatched a delegation of shamans in search of Aztlán, their original homeland. The magicians were transmuted into birds at the hill when they arrived, and they met Coatlicue, the mother of their god Huitzilopochtli, where she was dwelling. As they walked up a hill to meet her, it said they sank into the earth. Their mortal flesh was weighing them down in her exalted presence. She didn't greet them or welcome them. She scolded them for not bringing back her son, Huitzilopochtli, as had been promised. And she imparted upon the Aztec nation a curse against the empire. The magicians returned to Tenochtitlan with this doleful news. These events weren't supernatural again. Rather, they were part of the mystery that was inspired in nature, incipient in nature, at least in the sense of nature described in Jeff and Whitley's book, The Supernatural. But for the Spaniards, the supernatural auguries were propitious, foretelling their imminent triumphs. For the Aztecs, the events sealed their fate. Even as the Spaniards would become increasingly restrictive about wonders, dreams, and auguries that did not advance the Church's divine mission, the Inquisition would hunt these down with rigor and cruelty. In the era of contact, of first contact, these two stranger civilizations still shared kindred but contrasting experiences of living in a numinous world. This partial curated litany is a backstory to what would soon transpire in those lands of the ancestors to the north, in the lands that would become the borderlands of our time, the lands that would be shaped by unimaginable encounters between strangers throughout the centuries that followed. We imagine the past to remember the future. In 1528, just after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, Cabeza de Vaca and a host of Spanish compatriots were shipwrecked on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Survivors built new boats and followed the coast heading west, eventually running aground just south of here on Galveston Island, on an island they called La Isla Malado, the island of bad fate or misfortune. In this map of early Spanish explorations, De Vaca's journey through Texas is represented here in the number 3 line, passing through Galveston, a little closer to San Antonio than shows in this map, but eventually only 4 of the soldiers would survive, including the Moroccan slave Estebanico. They first encountered the Karankawas, then heading west for a pilgrimage of 8 years, they mingled with, were themselves enslaved by, and indeed learned from a host of other indigenous peoples in search of brethren Spanish explorers. De Vaca's Relación from 1555 was the first chronicle of the geography that would become the Texas borderlands. I was always entranced by the narrative of De Vaca and his party because they likely did pass through the environs of Bexar County, San Antonio, giving us a first glimpse of the people who dwelled near ancient San Antonio. The Relación is widely revered for details on linguistic diversity, the often forbidding landscape, the various plants, fish, and nuts the people subsisted on, and their often abject hunger when no sustenance was to be found. But the account also contains testimonios of the extraordinary events that followed the story of the first contact between worlds in these lands. De Vaca reports how he, Estebanico, and one other suddenly became sought-after healers to the indigenous peoples they found. Called upon to heal, they blew upon the afflicted, made the sign of the cross, recited the Salve Regina. In one remarkable passage, he observed the meeting of 2 elders from disparate tribes, and he described how they embraced and wept together for nearly an hour before speaking to one another, as if their speech was prefaced by some doleful, entirely psychic dialogue. And then Cabeza de Vaca blithely reports how he resurrected someone from the dead. He doesn't exult upon it or explain or dwell upon it. He glibly carries on with the story of his journey. He presses on to the west in search of Spanish comrades, and treating the indigenous to help him so that he may advocate for them against the cruelty they had already experienced from Spanish soldiers. During the years of De Vaca's long walkabout, in 1531, there occurred in Mexico City the series of apparitions experienced by young Chichimeca convert Juan Diego and his uncle Juan Bernardino that would produce the legendary tilma, a common Indian cloak, with an image of a brown woman depicted on it. As told in the Codex Nican Mapua, these apparitions took place just outside of Tenochtitlan, on the hill known as Tepeyac, the very hill where the Aztec goddess Tonantzin was worshipped. There was a powerful underlying continuity of extra-mundane interactions between the human and something else centered on that specific place, a continuity that could presumably shapeshift and manifest through new mythic vernaculars. How did that image take shape? Allegedly, no brushstrokes can be detected. It was somehow imprinted. Did the particles of pigment emerge out of the quantum ether? How was it that the image took shape of a brown, possibly pregnant woman in a starry blue mantle was so recognizable? Might not a mystic image have emerged that was unreadable to the witnesses? A Jackson Pollock splatter? Instead, this image communicated directly to those who saw it. It was a readable interpretation of something beyond or alongside the human into our history, so frequently a motif of the Aztec world. Her image would be propagated throughout Mexico, across the borderlands, from Brownsville to Los Angeles, and eventually the entire world. And just as the apparition spoke of being mother to all the people of the lands, the image on the tilma that is still venerated in the shrine at Tepeyac today is regarded as the palpable embodiment of a divine mother. Believers endlessly go back and forth on a subterranean moving sidewalk that gives the devotees their closest darshan with the image, looking up at it as they pass by. And this image sort of taken from that point of view. Many of you will know the story of Maria de Agreda, the cloistered Spanish nun who, between the years of 1620 and 1623, undertook a series of astral projections or bilocations to manifest herself as a lady in blue to the Jumano Indians who had been encountered on Juan de Oñate's earliest expeditions to what is now westernmost Texas, near present-day El Paso. In her spectral form, she would prepare them for the coming of the gospel and their salvation. Jumanos reported seeing just in such an apparition, and indeed the Coahuilteca descendants of the Mission Indians of San Antonio also tell of a lady in blue, though some say this was not, decidedly was not Maria de Agreda. They saw a water deity, a guardian of the abundant springs of those lands. In 1720, when Father Antonio Margil de Jesus founded the great mission San Jose de San Antonio, as a devotee of Maria de Agreda, he saw his work as the fulfillment of her prophetic compromiso, bilocating herself into these lands from 100 years before, a furthering of a deeper continuity of the impossible. A century on, he was merely an instrument of her power that she had manifested. When signing documents under his name, he would always inscribe la misma nada, the same nothing. Other extraordinary events of early Spanish settlers were reported: a fish that came back to life after being cooked in a soup, a sword previously owned by conquistador that began to glow red as if it had been pulled from a forge. Though the heat subsided, the blade remained blood red. These are secret matters, a chronicler wrote, reserved only for his divine majesty. Our understanding cannot grasp them, and thus my limited intellect precludes me discoursing upon them. Though he did allow himself to opine on the augury of the fiery sword, citing the Latin phrase, nihil fecit natura frustra, nothing happens against nature. He wrote how the crimson sword was a prediction of the many wars that would occur in the province. His divine majesty commonly permits signs that indicate future events. The Spanish divine outside of history could still communicate from the future into the world of history. And he was right. These lands would be haunted by bloody violence through the centuries that followed, reflected in several pages in a 1690 chronicle where there is a list of all the Indian nations of the lands that have vanished. The borderlands were destined to be prodigiously populated by the living alongside the specters of the dead. As the Cuban patriot and poet José Martí once put it, the conquistadores stole a page from the universe. But out of the mestizo world that emerged in the borderlands, mixing the blood and cultural ways of the indigenous and Spanish, and eventually many others, there also emerged extraordinary healers, such as Don Pedrito Jaramillo of Alfurias, Texas, Teresita Urrea of El Paso, and Niño Fidencio of Espinazo, Nuevo León. All three were born in central Mexico, but by the early 20th century, they all journeyed north into the borderlands to do their work. And all three used clairvoyance, spirit mediumship, and unique physical and herbal healing techniques in their ministries. Northern Mexico and South Texas became havens for these mystical, esoteric searchers. Francisco Madero of Coahuila, the revolutionary who was to become for a short time president of Mexico before his assassination, was a practitioner of Spiritism, a follower of Swedenborg and Madame Blavatsky. He channeled communications from the spirit guide presence of his dead brother Raúl, as well as two other entities. And amidst the chaos of the Revolución, he authored the Manual Espiritual, the Spiritist Manual, under the pseudonym Bima. Born in Piedras Negras and educated in Eagle Pass, Texas, Mexican philosopher José Vasconcelos was an enthusiast of Hindu mysticism and a theosophist. And in his essay, La Raza Cósmica, he argued that Mexico, with its mestizo hybrid heritage, merging all of humanity's origins, had a prophetic destiny in shaping a new human ethic with the emergence of a cosmic race. Though his legacy is fraught, Vasconcelos' influential mystical philosophy sought to overturn the race science of the castas, celebrating mixture over ethno-racial purity. Here's a bingo card of various permutations of mixtures that were part of the casta system. Jaramillo, Fidencio, and Urrea still have many followers across the Southwest. My late great-aunt Tia Pepa was a fidencista, a follower of Niño Fidencio. Harvard historian of Mesoamerican religion, David Carrasco, has written powerfully recently of his experiences with the community of fidencistas in the barrios of Chicago during his graduate studies at the University of Chicago, witnessing extraordinary scenes of mediumship and healing. Continuities continue. Botanica culture, venerating such healers as these, as well as creative amalgamations and improvisations on indigenous, African, and other esoteric beliefs and practices, remains a mainstay in the barrios across the borderlands. And there are new potencias, darker avatars who intervene in human affairs that have manifested in recent years, including Jesus Malverde and Santa Muerte, both associated with narcocultura in North Mexico and the borderlands. So let me just quickly share some notes specifically on the legacies of aerial phenomena in the borderlands before I move to some last reflections on all of this. Tales of extraordinary encounters with the strange were commonplace in Texas, so much so that the legendary folklorist J. Frank Dobie, no esoteric figure himself, blithely wrote about how a vaquero he knew in the 1950s, named Santos Cortez, very auspicious name, had a close encounter in the brush country near Cotula with a glowing ball of light that nearly blinded him. Cortez also reported that one night he'd awakened to find a bulto, a dark being or presence, weighing down upon his chest. He thought of, quote, the good God and of the Holy Virgin, and it ran off. No tracks were found. It was hard to avoid rumors and curiosity about UFOs while growing up in San Antonio. My Uncle Roger was convinced it was a matter of time before truth of the aliens visiting Earth would be revealed and the world would be changed forever. We'd be admitted into the cosmic fellowship or annihilated. a little bit of hope, a little bit of doom. He had a photograph of a silvery disc hovering over Popocatépetl, the volcano near Mexico City. He had another grainy photograph of the legendary 1952 Washington, D.C. flyover. Mexicanos love their UFOs or ovnis. They're even retablos, such as this one, traditional Mexican votive paintings commemorating close encounters. My favorite is one from, this one's from 1970, but this one here with the legend, "We were invaded by UFOs and the Virgencita protected us and nothing happened to us." Ironically, the last director of Project Blue Book, Hector Quintanilla, was a Mexican-American from San Antonio's west side. We had what was surely one of the first AM radio programs in the US to regularly report UFOs and other tales of high strangeness. It was the Talk of San Antonio in the late 60s on LBJ's WOAI radio station, hosted by Alan Dale. As a kid, I would tune in to hear Dale's reporting and call-ins on local UFO sightings, Bigfoot encounters, cattle mutilations. And once Dale was interviewing a West Texas sheriff about a textbook case of such a mutilation, where the cow's eyes, tongue, heart, and anus were bloodlessly removed with surgical precision, and the caller that was first picked up on had a solution to the mystery. It's an election year, and the Republicans are looking for any old asshole to run for governor. There were tales of the 1897 airship crash in Aurora, Texas, complete with references to an extraterrestrial being buried in the town graveyard. 2 Mexicano farm workers in Levelland, Texas in 1957, the year of my birth, saw a luminous egg-shaped object pass over them, seen by numerous others, in a case that Project Blue Book would attribute to ball lightning. Later, there would be the Cash Landrum encounter in 1979, just northeast of Houston, and the remarkable sightings in Stephenville in North Texas in 2008. But indeed, as Dana referred to earlier, New Mexico is arguably the epicenter of in the borderlands of the phenomenon. There are significant other unimaginable events, like the Phoenix Light sightings of 1997, but the palimpsest of tales of UFO legend, the crashes at Aztec and Roswell, the Lani Zamora Socorro encounter, and most recently revealed the crash in San Antonio, New Mexico, investigated in the new book Trinity, The Best Kept Secret by Jacques and Paula Leopizzi Harris, in which the 2 witnesses are Mexicano Mestizo shepherds. And there's also the so-called donation site we heard about earlier, written about by Diana in American Cosmic, a location in New Mexico where non-humans appear to have left behind objects to be recovered by questing humans, a kind of distanced contact through talismans. We can overlay upon that legacy the deep and profound place of New Mexico in Anasazi, Hopi, Navajo, Apache, Tewa, and other indigenous origin stories in the Four Corners, as well as the story of Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project, where the 20th century revelations of the quantum nature of the matter world were weaponized. The first test of a nuclear bomb at the Trinity site just some leagues away from the scene of the 1945 crash reported in the Nouvelle Harris book. And we should even add the presence of the Santa Fe Institute, a research community in 1984 of narratives concerning chaos, complexity, cosmology, and much else. Why all of this here, in this specific geography, this larger neighborhood? Indigenous creation stories, Spanish settlers, mixing of cultures, UFO crashes, the most fearsome weapon known to man, a community of minds seeking a new science. Why New Mexico? Why not South Dakota or Nebraska? Coincidence? Serendipity? What opaque geomancy might be at play with us through this tableau of incidents? Though he doesn't touch on UFOs or other high strangeness, the great science journalist George Johnson wrote about this in his brilliant Fire in the Mind, Faith and the Search for Order. In a landscape spiritually initiated by the indigenous peoples, he says, There seems to be something about the altitude here and the stark relief between mountain and desert that pushes speculation to the edge and makes even the most sober of scientists more reflective, more willing to turn science back on itself, to theorize about what it means to theorize and how we make our maps of the world. New Mexico is one of my other homelands. I began traveling there when I was a child, first with my parents and brothers into the Jemez Mountains in the northwest region of the state. My mother had political connections to then Lieutenant Governor Mondragon, and when we drove into Jemez, it was as if I had been returned to my true place of origin. All of us were moved. My dad had unexpected nosebleeds. When I went there later as a high school graduate to backpack, I ended up first at a Buddhist ashram, then working as a grip on the David Bowie film, The Man Who Fell to Earth, on the location at Fenton Lake, just outside of Jemez Springs. When I was next there in 1988, I was making a documentary about the harmonic convergence in Chaco Canyon, where 3,000 celebrants in full ritual engagement were commemorating the turn of ages in the ancient Mayan calendar. Every trip there was unexpectedly momentous. And I was last there in 9/11, when the plan for the day had been to visit the Museum of the Bomb with a traveling companion, and we did. The museum's somber underlying message was, some atrocities are necessary. Being there that day was a kind of immunization, witnessing the events in the city I lived in then, in New York City, as if they were a million miles away, as if on another planet. So why New Mexico for all of this history and for me? How did I come to discover and connect to New Mexico from my origins in Bexar County, Texas? This enigma takes us to a broader query where I'll conclude. Indeed, why all of these tales, signs of wonders through the centuries across the greater borderlands, threaded through so many Iberian, indigenous, and Mestizo lineages, raza lineages, families from all parts of the world, individual lives? There were confusions, contusions, illusions that beckoned to us for fathoming, for understanding. Who exactly were the numerous witnesses to these wonders? Were they randomly encountered, or perhaps determined, serially visited according to some unseen genetic algorithm playing out in deep time? We are all mestizos. Was the hybridity of the borderlands denizens a determining factor? How did experiencers record or remember their unimaginable encounters, or did they disregard them? These stories seem to take on a momentum, a directionality, a targetedness, a consciousness over the centuries. I'm reminded again of Terence McKenna. History is a shockwave of the eschaton, of eschatology. Elsewhere, he put it differently: history is a message from the ineffable. What if we're living in an echo of the future, pantomiming our way through these enigmas towards some knowing that beckons to us for some elusive reckoning with our cosmic citizenry, no more or less than any others, but experienced in this borderlands realm? What kinds of inquiry and knowledge building could help us to answer that question? What role could archives play in doing that? One of my literary ancestors, or literary mentors rather, Laura Riding Jackson, once wrote, "I propose that you seek in yourselves the remembrance of the before and write what you find and believe your words." Much of the history of impossible events I've shared here, I wrote into my last book. The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire, ostensibly a memoir of the lineages of my mother's families out of Asturias, Spain, and into Mexico, where they mixed with indigenous families. They arrived in northern Spain in 1620s, and they were founders of the Villas del Norte I showed you a map of earlier, the towns of the north, including Laredo, Texas, where my mother was born. I say ostensibly a memoir because while it's a work of nonfiction, it has a science fiction nervous system. I undertook a remembrance of the before, and I found a very strange tale. As I worked in the far-flung archives in Texas, Sevilla, and Asturias, and using research into family history amassed by my Tio Ludovico, my Uncle Lico, I realized there had always been a voice within me directing my inquiry into these family stories. It was a voice that had been with me since I was a child. Not my inner voice, but another voice within me seeking dialogue. He revealed himself as Cenote Siete, Jungle Spring 7, a time-traveling ancestor from the future, existing sometime in futurity after some undisclosed world-transforming event in a time he calls La Zona Perfecta, traversing time through the radio signals emitted by our DNA, a kind of genetic geolocating technology. He had been in contact with my Uncle Lico and many others, he said, earlier in our lineage, subtly directing our fascinations with these lands and the stories that shaped us, with our origins, evolution, our genealogies, transformation, our destinies. Hence, an ancestor from the future. This is one of Uncle Lico's genealogies with King of Spain at the top, just King of Spain. Through literary dowsing, unexpected downloads, automatic writing, Cenote Siete ended up writing half of the book. And so a tale that began as a search into the deepest sources of a family past became a message from the future about the nature of the Borderlands as a stage of imminence, a place where events, ordinary and confounding over the centuries and indeed millennia, are revealing an epic of human becoming. Through Cenote Siete, I realized I hadn't just been intrigued with high strangeness because of eccentric uncles or pop culture, or because of my own uncanny sightings and synchronicities. I had been seeded with these affinities from the beginning, through this dialogue, seeking what it was to be human into the past, the unfathomable past, and an unimaginable future. He led me to a way of inhabiting the story, not just telling the story, but inhabiting it, embodying it. I was drawn to the story because I was already in it, in medias res, the story of the emergence of Mestizo mind. Other voices, such as Carlos Castaneda and Gloria Ansaldúa, have told stories of the transformation of Mestizo mind in the Borderlands, involving dramatic encounters with supernatural presences rooted in the indigenous cosmovision, transpiring in Borderlands settings. In the duality of the Mestizo mind, Western and indigenous, Castaneda and Ansaldúa, in distinct and complex ways, both seek to turn toward the indigenous legacies of these lands to reveal themselves into a transmuted future. Their respective sagas are initiatory of new ways of being, but they confess themselves as emerging from ancient sources of knowledge. The phenomenon is here about a dialogue with the future, reminding me of my colleague David Carrasco's frequent citing of Carlos Fuentes that we imagine the past to remember the future. Another voice reshaping the Mestizo mind I'll point you to quickly. I'd like to just mention this young San Antonio-based musician and producer, Joaquin Muerte, whose compelling podcast, Chicanx versus Aliens, is based on interviews and personal reflections on high strangeness in the Chicanx world of the now. Glowing orbs in Grandmom's kitchen, the healer Pedrito Jaramillo manifesting to heal Joaquin's ailing father, and how the craft that crashed in Roswell might have visited Laredo, Texas the days before. I know the archives of the impossible will be invaluable for searchers seeking to fathom underlying stories like these unfolding amidst all the enigma of the phenomenon. In my brief visit there, I imagined projects to return and pursue. In the boxes of communion letters, how many could I find with Borderlands connections, with experiencers who came out of Mestizo heritages in the lands? I found a few. I got, in that first box, I got through the letter A, more or less. There are a lot of Andersons and Bennetts. I haven't found a lot of Garcias yet. But there are surely patterns of place and heritage that might offer a compelling lens onto these extraordinary narratives. In the boxes of material related to Edwin May's work in the controlled remote viewing program, I wondered about the juxtaposition of non-locality and specific geography and place. What does the Borderlands legacy of the so-called paranormal the geography of that space looked like through the process of remote viewing. I was there for a day, so these are projects and stories that would require a considerably longer sojourn to address. So taken together over a considerable span of time and geography, perhaps these stories, personages, events, and encounters do suggest a tale of becoming, of a widening embrace of the impossible in the Borderlands, a sanctuary of liminality and hybridity, slowly revealing something new about our humanity through a cosmic lens. Whether these lands emerged circumstantially as a cultural and historical stage for these phenomena, or there is something implicit about the land itself as a ground for these encounters, well, that's the nucleus of a mystery to explore further. In his introduction to the philosophy of history, Hegel characteristically advocated for a cultural historical interpretation when he wrote of America as the land of the future, where in the ages that lie before us, the burden of the world's history shall reveal itself, perhaps in a contest between North and South America. It is a land of desire for all those who are weary of the historical lumber room of old Europe. Dostoevsky, conversely, marveled at the infinite wonders of place when he wrote, "There was a foreboding of eternity in a yard of space." Thanks very much, y'all. Thank you for tolerating this and all the light show.